All right, in this first unit of the course, we're looking at the big metaphysical question to do with the existence of God. This is a big metaphysical question, obviously, because it has lots of implications for other metaphysical questions. What view you take on this matter, of course, will have implications for the views that you take on other kinds of metaphysical questions. So in this unit of the course, we'll take a look at some of the classic arguments for the existence of God and some of the traditional criticisms of those arguments. We have a short selection from Aquinas' Summa Theologica, just a very short excerpt from a long work, but three of the characteristic arguments in Aquinas' thinking. So in the selection that we have, Aquinas doesn't start in right away. What you will have noticed is that he doesn't straight away start in on his own argument or arguments for the existence of God. He starts off talking about a couple of objections, considerations that earlier philosophers have had for denying the existence of God, for answering this question whether God exists in the negative rather than the affirmative. He takes up a couple of old objections, a couple of long-standing objections. And in the short excerpt that we have, he doesn't really address those objections head on. He just goes on to give his own arguments for the existence of God. But it'll be helpful for us to spend a little bit of time on those objections because the pattern of reasoning involved, some of the philosophical inferences involved, we will see come up in later units of the course. So it'll be worth our while to spend a little bit of time on these objections, even though Aquinas doesn't address them directly. He just states them, and then in the passage that we have, he just proceeds to give his own arguments for the existence of God. The first objection he states is that if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. Okay, so what is Aquinas referring to here? What is he referring back to in the earlier history of philosophy? Well, in the first lecture, I touched on this pre-Socratic school of philosophers in ancient Greece in the beginnings of Western philosophy. There were these different pre-Socratic schools. I mentioned last time Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes. These were the Milesians. And I said last time that philosophy began with speculation about the ultimate makeup, the ultimate constituents, the ultimate organizing principle of the universe, of physical reality. And as I said last time, this kind of speculation involved oftentimes a kind of scientific hypothesis, but it was also kind of a philosophical, broader philosophical hypothesis as well, or hypotheses as well. Here again, as I said last time, science, as we would think of it today, and philosophy, not clearly distinguished yet in this early phase of Western intellectual history. But it was characteristic of that first school of philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, that they put forward candidates for this ultimate principle or ultimate material basis for the world. Thales, for example, conjectured that all of the apparent diversity of substances actually reduced down to water. Water is at the basis of all of physical reality. Another of these pre-Socratic thinkers, Anaximenes, argued that air was the ultimate physical principle of the universe and all the apparent diversity. What I mean by that is we certainly seem to see a variety of substances. We certainly seem to see an array of substances. But Thales argued that actually underlying all of them was a single fundamental element, water. Anaximenes argued that it was air. Another pre-Socratic philosopher, Heraclitus, would argue that it was fire. So here again, this was a characteristic theme of early philosophy, in this early pre-Socratic era. Anaximander, another of these Milesian philosophers that I mentioned, is shown here. This is a relief sculpture of Anaximander. He argued in a way that amounted to a kind of sophisticated metaphysical move that the fundamental principle of physical reality, the fundamental stuff of the universe, could not be one of the familiar elements. So, as against someone like Thales or Heraclitus, he argued it couldn't be something like water or it couldn't be something like fire. Because if there were one fundamental principle and it were such that you could identify it with one of the familiar elements, well, lots of the elements have opposed properties. Fire and water cannot exist in the same place. Say, for example, if it's a relatively small quantity of fire, then the water will douse the fire. If it's a relatively small quantity of water, then of course the fire will burn it away. So the two can't coexist. Not in the same place at the same time anyway, obviously at different places or at different times. But the idea of the fundamental principle was the idea of something that was infinite in extension, and all the different varieties of substance could be reduced down to, had as their basic principle, some one underlying stuff, some one underlying natural kind. So because some of the elements have opposed properties, Anaximander made this sophisticated metaphysical move. That's why I say it wasn't just a kind of scientific hypothesis, it was a kind of metaphysical insight as well. Made this sophisticated move of saying that the first principle of physical reality could not be one of the familiar elements, because if one of them were infinite, it would have driven the others out of existence already. So Anaximander actually argued that the underlying physical basis, the first principle of physical reality, is an indefinite, unbounded, unlimited stuff, which itself is not given to us directly in perception, which itself we don't see. We see the familiar elements like earth and water and fire, but we don't actually directly observe this underlying physical basis of all those different substances, according to Anaximander. So that was both kind of a subtle scientific hypothesis and a subtle metaphysical argument as well. So in any case, the principle that Aquinas is referring to here is an old one in the history of philosophy. Here again, if an infinite amount of, say, fire existed in the universe, how could water exist as well? If the fire were infinite, if it were the fundamental basis of everything else, then everything opposed to it would have already gone out of existence. So there wouldn't be any water. So there couldn't be water too, right? So anyway, that was Anaximander's argument. And so Aquinas notes that objection because, of course, he's arguing for a concept of God, God conceived of as an infinite being, God conceived of as a supremely good being. And a Christian philosopher in the Middle Ages has to meet objections that go back a long, long way in the history of philosophy, centuries before Christianity. Anaximander, for example, lived in the 6th century BC, so there was a long philosophical tradition before this specifically Christian concept of God developed, and that's the concept for which Aquinas is arguing. And that is the concept of God that is infinite and supremely good. So if there were one principle at work in the universe and it were divine, then why would anything opposed to the supremely good nature of the infinite first principle, God, why would anything opposed to that exist? Why would there be evil? Why would there be any badness? So if an infinitely good being exists, how can evil also exist? If two forces are opposed, and one of them is infinite, how could the other exist? So this is an objection that Aquinas touches on. I'm giving you more of the historical background to what he actually says in our short selection. I'm explaining what the broader intellectual, the broader historical and philosophical context is. That's part of my job in this class, to go through the readings with you and to tell you a little bit more about the broader historical and philosophical and intellectual context, to help you situate what's going on in any particular reading. We just have short excerpts from much longer works, so hopefully you'll find that helpful. And that's the background to this objection. Another objection that he mentions, as he puts it, is that it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. So this is an old idea in Western philosophy as well. It's the idea that sometimes goes by the name Occam's razor, or it's sometimes called the parsimony principle, or the simplicity criterion, or it's this idea sometimes simply put in terms of economy of theory. Your theory ought to be economical. Occam's razor is the idea, or is the thesis, that one ought not to put forward explanatory entities beyond what is necessary to account for the evidence. If two theories by hypothesis explain some phenomenon equally well, the simpler theory of the two is more likely to be correct. So this is an old idea in philosophy. It goes by the name Occam's razor. William of Occam, after the medieval philosopher William of Occam, who lived in the 14th century, he came a little bit later than Aquinas. Aquinas lived in the 13th century. Aquinas was a little bit earlier, so the objection that Aquinas is noting here is an old objection in the history of philosophy, but it probably is most associated, that basic methodological principle that you should not posit explanatory entities beyond what is necessary to account for the evidence. That methodological principle, which is still today a first principle in both scientific method and philosophy. It goes by the name William of Occam because it's so closely associated with his writing on that topic. So even though I'm not going exactly in historical chronological order here, Aquinas wouldn't have known it by that name because William of Occam came a little bit later. I'll just use that kind of shorthand to refer to this old idea in the history of philosophy, which has come to be called Occam's razor, or here again the parsimony principle. You want your theory to be relatively simple. It's a virtue in a theory that it is simple. Again, everything else being equal, the simpler of two theories is more likely to be correct. Now, it's not always the case that everything else is equal. Sometimes the more complex theory, sometimes the more complicated theory actually does have more explanatory power. So this simplicity criterion is not decisive. There are a lot of criteria that we use to assess theories. There are a lot of criteria that we use to evaluate theories, and no one of them is decisive. Some theories do relatively well by some criteria and not so well by others. Some theories are stronger as assessed by some criteria and not so strong as assessed by others. There's no simple answer to the question which criterion is the most important, but most philosophers and scientists see simplicity as an important criterion in the evaluation of a theory. And the idea behind the objection would be that the things in nature, natural phenomena, can be explained by some fundamental principle at work in the natural world. Let's just call it nature. And then perhaps not everything can be explained by some underlying cause or principle of all physical events. It may be the case that human action, it may be the case that human deliberation and decision and acting in the world, human decision making, all of this perhaps is a distinct domain that requires an explanatory principle of its own, a principle distinct from the principle that would explain all the different kinds of physical events in the physical world. But presumably there would be a fundamental principle of human agency, as it's sometimes called, our capacity for acting. And let's just call that fundamental principle will, this capacity that we have to deliberate, to choose, to decide, to act. Okay, so maybe two principles are necessary, but the argument would be, or the objection that Aquinas is considering here, would be that those two principles suffice to account for everything. All natural events, that is to say all physical events and all events in the physical world, can be accounted for by some fundamental principle of physical reality, and then all events in the domain of human action can be accounted for by some fundamental explanatory principle, the principle of human will. Okay, so why posit God would be the objection. Given the already existing explanatory principles, isn't such a principle superfluous? That is to say, if these two principles already suffice to explain all the phenomena, both natural phenomena and phenomena in human affairs, then why posit another explanatory entity? Here again, to say that there are just the two principles would be the relatively simpler theory, wouldn't it? That would be a theory that would do better by the simplicity criterion. Okay, so again, Aquinas notes that objection as well. And again, he doesn't meet either in the short excerpt that we have, the short selection from the Summa that we have. He doesn't address either of those objections in a straightforward or in a head-on way. He just notes them and then proceeds to give his arguments for the existence of God. Those are two kinds of considerations that historically philosophers had in Aquinas' time, looking back, had for answering the question, does God exist, in the negative, denying or doubting the existence of God. And so Aquinas proceeds to give his arguments for the existence of God. Now, as I said in this first unit of the course, we're going to look at some of the classic arguments for the existence of God. And in our selections from Aquinas, in our selections from the Summa, we have three versions of what has come to be known as the Cosmological Argument. So I'm going to follow the presentation of our text, the presentation of Bonjour and Baker, in dividing up Aquinas' arguments under these three headings: the argument from motion, the argument from efficient causation, and the argument from contingency. So in the case of some of these, I'll paraphrase what I take to be the essentials of Aquinas' argument. In the case of the argument from motion, this first version of the cosmological argument, I'll just be pretty much quoting the elements that are basically already in place in the text. Sometimes I'll paraphrase. In the case of this argument, you can almost just directly quote it. It's stated pretty succinctly in the passage that we have. So the cosmological argument, in all versions of it, really begins from a certain observation. It begins from the observation that we find ourselves in a cosmos. We find ourselves in a physical world, in a physical universe, in a physical reality. That's an a posteriori basis from which to begin. This term a posteriori means drawn from observation. So we find ourselves in a universe. Sometimes a posteriori truths are contrasted with a priori truths. This term a priori is a Latin term for not based on observation. There are some things that we know that are not based on experience or not based on observation. It's arguably the case that our knowledge in many domains is a priori, independent of observation. What I mean by that is the truth of the proposition doesn't depend on any empirical procedure. It's arguably the case that knowledge in mathematics, for example, is a priori. It doesn't depend on any empirical procedure. What I would mean by that is some process of observing, some experiential process. So take, for example, the commutativity of multiplication, let's say, for example. A times B is equal to B times A. That would be an element of knowledge in arithmetic. I take it that everyone knows that. But you can't say that your justification for knowing that is a kind of empirical procedure, right? Did you substitute every possible value for A and B in the case of that proposition and make sure that it works every time? No, it's not possible. It's not possible to substitute every possible value for A and B in that formula, in that identity statement. A times B is equal to B times A. It's not possible to substitute every possible value to verify that that is the case, is it? Because the number of numbers is infinite. So of course that's not possible. And yet you know that. You know that that is true. How is that possible? Well, it's arguably the case that that's a kind of non-experiential knowledge, a kind of a priori knowledge. Knowledge that doesn't depend on any truth of observation or any empirical procedure. So oftentimes in the course we'll distinguish between a priori claims that don't depend on experience for their truth, and a posteriori claims that do depend on experience for us to say that we know them for their truth. The cosmological argument begins from an a posteriori premise. It begins from the observation that we find ourselves in a world, in a physical reality, in a universe, in a cosmos, hence the name, cosmological argument. And then it also proceeds from certain further facts about that physical universe in which we find ourselves. So the first version of the argument that we have in our selections is the argument from motion. It begins from the premise that we notice that some things are in motion. So premise 1, some things are in motion. So let's stipulate that for the sake of argument. I think most people would be willing to agree to that premise. It seems reasonably uncontroversial. Although I mentioned in the first lecture that even in pre-Socratic, even in early Greek philosophy, there was a skeptical school, the Eleatic philosophers, who would deny that motion is real. So Zeno of Elea, I mentioned last time, Parmenides, I mentioned, they would both deny that anything is in motion. Actually, reality is unchanging, it's a unity, and it is motionless. Again, unchanging. That it is unchanging entails that there is no motion. At least that's the way that the Eleatic philosophers would have thought about it. But let's put that skeptical worry to the side for the moment. Let's stipulate the reasonably uncontroversial premise that some things are in motion. We do seem to observe that in the physical world around us. Okay, some things are in motion. Premise 2, whatever is moved by another. Premise 3, the relation of mover to moved cannot go on to infinity. Therefore, conclusion, a first mover is necessary. Okay, so that's the argument. Let's think a little bit about that second premise. Whatever is moved by another. Why does Aquinas take himself to be justified in presenting that premise as a claim that we should accept? Whatever is moved by another. Let's talk a little bit about the background to premise 2. Well, nothing, according to Aquinas, is the cause of its own motion. For it to be so, that is to say, for something to be the cause of its own motion, it would have to go from potentiality to actuality without any motion having initiated the change. Because if something initiated the change, then it would have to be in a state of actuality, that is to say, actual motion, before it is in the state of actuality, which is a contradiction. So Aquinas is appealing to an old metaphysical distinction. This distinction between potentiality and actuality goes back to Aristotle. As we're going to see, Aquinas drew very heavily on Aristotelian metaphysics. He drew very heavily on the work of the 4th century BC Greek philosopher Aristotle. And in particular, he gives a lot of weight to this distinction between potentiality and actuality, which was a key distinction in so much of Aristotle's metaphysics. So thinking back to premise 2 for a moment, again, the claim is that whatever is moved by another. Okay, why is that true? Why must we accept the truth? Why ought we to accept the truth of that premise? Well, there would be a kind of contradiction in denying it. Something can't be the cause of its own motion. to say that something is the cause of its own motion involves a kind of contradiction, as Aquinas sees it. And this is, here again, an old idea in philosophy. This goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle would agree that there would be a kind of contradiction involved in saying that, and saying that something is the cause of its own motion. Here again, let's suppose that something is potentially in motion. Okay. Well, if it is set in motion, then it goes from potentially in motion to actually in motion. But now, what brought about that transition? What initiated that change? What initiated that change from being potentially in motion to being actually in motion? If the cause of the change were in the thing itself, then that change would itself be a kind of motion. That change from potentially in motion to now actually in motion, whatever triggered that change, would itself be a kind of motion. We have to understand here again, as part of the context, that both Aristotle and Aquinas have a very broad concept of motion. Really, all change is a kind of motion. So it's important that we understand this about the argument. When you hear the word motion, you might think of what we sometimes call locomotion, movement from one place to another place. But in the broader sense in which Aquinas and Aristotle are using this term, any kind of change is a motion. So even if something is just standing still in the same place, but it's undergoing changes in that same place, then that is a kind of motion in the sense that is involved in this argument, in the sense that that term would be understood by Aquinas and Aristotle. So even a tree shedding its leaves, say for example, is not moving from one place to another, but it is undergoing a kind of motion, a kind of change. Okay, so that's what you have to understand as part of the background to this premise. That's why Aquinas takes it as justified to assert that whatever is moved is moved by another. Because here again, something cannot move itself. Something cannot have the cause of its going from potentially in motion to actually in motion in itself. Because if the cause were in itself, whatever here again triggered that shift from potentially in motion to actually in motion would itself be a kind of motion. So to deny that premise, to deny P2, premise 2, would involve a kind of contradiction, as Aquinas understands it anyway. So that's what's involved in the background of premise 2. Think of it in terms of this analogy. How could something potentially hot come to be actually hot without having caused to become so by something already actually hot? The entity that is potentially hot could not be the cause of its own heat. To do so, here again, it would have to already have the property of actual hotness present in it before it were actually hot. What would bring about the hotness? Well, some antecedent kind of hotness, but in that case it would be going from potentially to actually before it was actually. Here again, a kind of contradiction. So again, this is an old idea in philosophy that goes back to Aristotle in the 4th century BC. Aristotle wrote in the Physics that matter will not move itself. Aristotle writes in the Physics, how will there be movement if there's no actual cause? Here again, by actual, what would be meant here would be by way of contrast with potential. So something that is actually in motion was at some point potentially in motion. But how would there be no movement? Sorry, let me start that again. How will there be movement if there is no actual cause? Matter will not move itself. So it's an old idea in philosophy that matter on the one hand and motion on the other hand, these are distinct concepts. What is really involved in the concept of matter? Extension, that is to say, the idea of filling some region of space. Size, every particle of matter has some size or other. Shape, every particle of matter has some shape or other. Basically size, shape, extension, these are the elements of our concept of matter. But nowhere in that concept is there the concept of motion, right? Those are distinct concepts. So given that we find the material world to be in motion, there has to be some explanation for that fact, but that explanation can't be found in matter itself, because there's nothing in the concept of matter other than the concept of size, shape, and extension. They're distinct concepts, aren't they? So that's an old idea in the history of philosophy. That fact that metaphysical fact led Aristotle to infer that there has to be a mover that moves without being moved. So here again, we've seen that premise 2 in the argument for motion is that nothing can be the cause of its own motion. There has to be a mover which moves without being moved. A mover that is eternal, substance, and actuality. By substance, Aristotle would mean here an independently existing thing, something that doesn't depend on its existence. And something that doesn't depend for its existence on something else. That's what Aristotle means here. And there would have to, this mover that moves without being moved would have to be eternal and would have to be actual, here again in the sense having to do with the distinction between potentiality and actuality. That is to say, there has to be a being that never went from potentiality to actuality. And of course that being would be a one-of-a-kind being, because everything in this physical world at some point went from potentiality to actuality. Every oak tree, for example, begins as an acorn. An acorn is always potentially an oak tree, but it's not actually an oak tree until the relevant physical changes happen. Sperm and egg are always potentially a human being, but here again, conception has to happen, and all the other processes that go into an egg developing into a human being, all those processes have to unfold before we would say that the genetic elements of conception are a human being, although they're always potentially a human being. So let's maybe just retrace the steps in the argument. Well, going the wrong way, sorry about that. Some things are in motion. Whatever is moved by another. The relation of mover to moved cannot go on to infinity. Let's think about that third premise a little bit here. Why can't that relation of mover to moved go on for infinity? The thought here is an old one in philosophy, and here again the thought would go back to Aristotle as well. This basic thesis that Aquinas is drawing on would trace back to Aristotle's metaphysics as well. Again, Aquinas is employing much of Aristotle's metaphysics to construct arguments for the existence of God as Aquinas conceives God, which would be a different conception from what you would find in Aristotle in the 4th century BC. But many of the elements of his metaphysics Aquinas is employing here in this medieval context. So it's an old idea in philosophy that the relation of mover to moved cannot go on to infinity. In the case of any particular thing being moved, we can give a perfectly good explanation of that particular motion by saying what caused A to move. A perfectly fine explanation would be to say A was moved by B, where B is just the antecedent, the earlier moving thing that set the next thing in motion, right? But of course that same question could be raised about B, right? What set it in motion? And it would be a perfectly fine explanation to say, well, B was set in motion by C. Okay. And of course that same question could be raised about C, whatever C is. Well, C was set in motion by D. All right, but that form of explanation cannot go on forever, can it? Because if that form of explanation, X was put in motion by the prior moving thing, if that form of explanation stretched backward for infinity, then we never actually get to an explanation for why there is motion at all, do we? We never actually get to an explanation for why there is this chain of succeeding motions, one event succeeding another, a succession of motions. We never actually get to an explanation for why there is motion in the chain in the first place, if we think that the explanation is of this form. Oh, X was moved by the prior moving thing. X was moved by the previous moving thing. That form of explanation is fine for any particular moving thing. But that can't be the ultimate explanation, can it? That can't be the explanation for why there is motion at all, for why there is motion in the succession of events at all, can it? So that would be the thought behind premise 3. So here again, some things are in motion. Whatever is moved by another. The relation of mover to moved cannot go on to infinity. Therefore, a first mover is necessary. So God conceived of as a first mover is an old idea in Western philosophy. It goes back to Aristotle. And Aquinas here, in his presentation of the cosmological argument, is also conceiving of God as the first mover. So that's one way that God is conceived in these arguments, in these cosmological arguments that we find in Aquinas. The second version of the cosmological argument in our selections from Aquinas is the argument from efficient causation. So I'll paraphrase it. As I would summarize it, premise 1, there are efficient causes. Premise 2, nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. Premise 3, the order of efficient causes cannot stretch back to infinity. Therefore, conclusion, there is a first efficient cause. So in this version of the cosmological argument, God is conceived of as the first efficient cause. Here again, in the argument from motion, God is conceived as the first mover. In this version of the argument, God is conceived as the first efficient cause. Here again, this is a kind of a posteriori argument. It begins from a truth of observation. There are efficient causes. So when we look around the natural world, we see lots of agents of change, lots of entities that take raw materials and impose form on them. So birds build nests, spiders spin webs, beavers build dams. We see lots of examples, to say nothing of human beings, right? We see lots of examples of what are sometimes called in metaphysics agents of change. Beings that act in such a way as to impose form on matter. That's the basic idea behind an efficient cause. And here again, that there are such entities in the world around us, that there are efficient causes, that seems like a reasonably uncontroversial premise. Let's stipulate that that is true. There are efficient causes. An efficient cause is whatever makes something. That's the basic idea. And here again, that's a kind of a posteriori truth, a kind of truth of observation. We look at the world in which we find ourselves and we notice that there are efficient causes, beings that take raw material and impose form on them. A bird's nest isn't just thrown together by the laws of physics, right? Or a spider's web or a dam such as beavers would build. All these things involve arrangement, organization, ordering. So looking at the natural world in which we find ourselves and the domain of human action as well, we do notice that there are efficient causes. So that seems like a reasonably uncontroversial premise. Let's stipulate that that is true. Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. So here again, this is a metaphysical insight now. The first premise here again is a kind of a posteriori truth. I gave an example of an a priori truth a moment ago. Here again, by way of contrast with the a posteriori, something like the commutativity of multiplication would be a kind of a priori truth. We know that that is true. We know that multiplication is a commutative operation. A times B is always going to be identical to B times A. But that's not a kind of experiential knowledge, is it? There isn't any empirical procedure that you go through to demonstrate the truth of that principle. That's kind of a priori knowledge. By way of contrast, here again, an a posteriori claim or an a posteriori truth would just be any truth of experience, any truth of observation, something that we need to learn about the world by observing. And many philosophical arguments begin from those kinds of premises as well, such as that there is motion or there are efficient causes. So just by a posteriori, here again, just anything that you would have to look to verify. So when presented with the proposition A times B is equal to B times A, you know that that is true, but you don't have to look around to find some verification in the physical world to establish the truth of that proposition. By way of contrast, take a proposition like the cat is on the mat. Is that true? Well, you would have to look around to find out, wouldn't you? You would have to go verify. You would have to go check to see if that is the case. So if it is indeed true that the cat is on the mat, then that would be a kind of a posteriori truth. Or so many of the discoveries in the natural sciences, right? That water is H2O, say for example. That's a kind of a posteriori truth. People have had a concept of water for a long time, but it's a relatively recent discovery in human history that water is H2O. Water is identical to the substance that has as its molecular structure hydrogen and oxygen atoms in that ratio. So that's a kind of a posteriori truth as well. Just any mundane truth of observation, like the cat is on the mat, or there's milk in the fridge, something like that, or any kind of discovery in the physical sciences. Those are all a posteriori. Okay. So again, I mentioned that distinction between a posteriori and a priori because it comes up a lot in philosophy. It comes up a lot in the readings that we'll have, not only in this unit of the course, but in other units of the course as well. So back to the argument from efficient causation. There are efficient causes. Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. The order of efficient causes cannot stretch back to infinity. Therefore, there is a first efficient cause. Okay, so we notice that the structure of this argument is very similar to the argument from motion. Very similar structure. Here again, the argument appeals to this idea that when we explain one contingent thing in terms of the previous contingent thing, that suffices as an explanation for that particular thing, but that form of explanation can't go on forever, right? It can't stretch backwards forever. So the same basic idea. Where did A come from? Oh, well, A was brought about by the efficient cause B. Well, where did B come from? Oh, B was brought about by the efficient cause C. Well, where did C come from? Oh, C was brought about by efficient cause D. Here again, that form of explanation works for any contingent thing. But it can't stretch backwards forever, or you never actually get an explanation for this basic fact about the cosmos, that there are efficient causes. Why is that the case? Why is there the succession of efficient causes at all? That is to say, why does the chain itself exist? The succession of things arranged in that way. A is the efficient cause of B, B is the efficient cause of C, C is the efficient cause of D. Why is there that chain at all? To answer that question, you can't say, oh, because of the previous efficient cause, right? That's not going to suffice as an explanation because the same question could be raised about the previous efficient cause. So structurally similar to what we saw in the argument from motion. Let me explain a little bit more what is meant here by an efficient cause. Here again, Aquinas is drawing on elements of Aristotle's metaphysics. Aristotle distinguished four kinds of causes. He said for every natural phenomenon, there are four causes at work. There are four explanatory entities or four reasons at work. The material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Later in this unit of the course, we will be looking at arguments that appeal to the concept of God as a final cause. That is to say, there has to be some highest goal of the universe. That's a different kind of argument from the one that we're considering right now, but this is another conception of Aristotelian causation that will play into some of the classic arguments for the existence of God. But to focus for the moment on the efficient cause, the paradigmatic, the kind of classic example that Aristotle gives in more than one place in both his book The Physics and in his book The Metaphysics, would be of a sculpture. So the material of a sculpture, say for example the material cause might be bronze or it might be marble, as in this example here. The formal cause is just the arrangement of the material. So in everything that comes about in the phenomenal world, everything that comes about in the natural world, there is some material basis for it. But of course matter doesn't just arrange itself into the form of a bird's nest or the form of a dam or the form of a spider's web or the form of a sculpture. There has to be some form imposed on the matter to make it the kind of thing that it is. In the case of this example, the efficient cause would be the sculptor. There has to be some agent of change. That's what is meant by an efficient cause. Some being that takes unformed matter, unformed materials, and imposes form on them. So that's what is meant by the efficient cause. And then the fourth cause, the fourth explanatory factor that is at work in every natural phenomenon, according to Aristotle, is the final cause. The Greek term is telos, which is the goal, the purpose, the end. An agent doesn't just take raw material and impose form on it for no reason at all. There's always some goal, always some purpose that explains why the agent of change imposed that particular form on the materials, right? In the case of a sculptor, his purpose was to create a likeness of some human subject maybe, or to maybe the purpose of the sculptor was to pay homage, to pay tribute to some famous historical person, or maybe to a Greek god or something like that. Of course, the sculptor might also have as his goal the practical end of making money, getting paid. So for every human action, but this extends to anything that acts in this broad sense of acting, namely taking materials and imposing form on them, for every being that acts, there's always a purpose. There's always an end. There's a goal for a bird's arranging twigs into a nest. The goal is shelter, protection for eggs, and so forth. So those are the four causes at work in every natural phenomenon, according to Aristotle. And Aquinas is drawing on that old Aristotelian conception of causation when he says that there has to be a first efficient cause. And so in this version of the cosmological argument, God is conceived as the first maker, the first efficient cause. God took the raw materials that were potentially a universe, were potentially a cosmos, and imposed form on those raw materials. The third version of the cosmological argument that we have in our selections is known as the argument from contingency. So this argument relies on another basic metaphysical distinction. I've talked about a few metaphysical distinctions today, the distinction between potentiality and actuality. I've talked about what is really an epistemological distinction, a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. Another basic metaphysical distinction would be the distinction between contingency and necessity. What do I mean by contingency? With respect to everything around us in the universe, it seems like it could have not existed. That's what we mean by something's being contingent. If something is contingent, it could have not existed. Now, the argument from contingency ends by inferring a necessary being to explain why there is the whole succession of contingent beings in the first place. So by necessary, we would mean, one way that we might think of it would be this: could not have not existed. We saw Aristotle say a moment ago that there has to be an eternal mover, right? Well, an eternal being could not have not existed. It's in the nature of eternity. It's in the nature of an eternal being. It would be an essential truth about an eternal being that it has always existed. Therefore, an eternal being could not have not existed. So if contingent means could have not existed, and it seems like that's true of pretty much everything that we find in the world around us, everything is contingent. It could have not existed. Then the point of contrast would be a necessary being. And in the case of the argument from contingency, God is conceived of as the necessary being. So the argument, as I would paraphrase it, would be things in the world could have not existed. And Aquinas further stipulates that anything that could have not existed did not exist at some time. Because if it did not exist, if there were not a time when it did not exist, then it would be an eternal being, right? But if it were an eternal being, then it wouldn't be a contingent being. It wouldn't be true that it could have not existed. So anything that could have not existed at some time did not exist. Okay, third premise. If everything is contingent, then at some point nothing existed. Okay, that claim seems a little more questionable. This argument has been criticized mainly with respect to that third premise. So I'll come back to this point in a moment. But that has been a historical criticism of this argument. Fourth premise, something cannot come from nothing. So I touched on this principle in the first lecture as well. Nothing comes into existence out of nothing. Nothing comes into existence, to use the Latin term ex nihilo, out of nothing. Something cannot come from nothing. It's an old idea in metaphysics. Well, given those premises, there is a necessary being. There has to be a being that is not a contingent being. There has to be a being that could not have not existed. There has to be an eternal being. There has to be a being that depends on its a being that does not depend on anything else for its existence. That's also what we would mean by a necessary being. Here again, another way that we might make out the concept of contingency would be to say that a contingent thing depends on something else for its existence. It depended on something else to bring it into existence. So every human being is contingent. For example, every human being was brought into existence by previous human beings. So every human being is contingent. And it seems like that's true not only of human beings, but of everything in the physical world. Everything is contingent, could have not existed, or, as we might understand it another way, was brought into existence by something else. So that would be the argument from contingency, and it leads us to the necessity, a kind of logical necessity of positing a being that is not contingent. Here again, structurally, it's very similar to the other versions of the cosmological argument that we've looked at, right? How could there be an infinitely long succession of contingent beings? Here again, for any particular contingent thing, it's a fine explanation to say he or she or it was brought about by previous contingent things. So here again, let's take the case of a particular human being. John is a contingent entity. He was brought into existence by antecedent, prior contingent entities. His parents, let's say William and Mary. Where did William come from? Where did Mary come from? Well, from the previous pair of contingent beings. Well, where did they come from? Well, from the previous pair of contingent beings. Okay, but if we extend that pattern of explanation now not just to human beings, but to all contingent things, which is to say all things in the physical universe, here again, that form of explanation can't stretch backwards forever, can it? Or at least that's the thought behind the argument from contingency, this third version of the cosmological argument. It's a perfectly fine form of explanation for any particular contingent thing. Oh, where did that come from? Oh, from the previous contingent thing. But that form of explanation here again wouldn't work for the basic metaphysical question, why is there a succession of contingent things at all? Where did this chain of contingent beings brought about in succession, one contingent thing giving rise to another, where did that basic fact about the cosmos, where does the explanation of that come in? Here again, the explanation for that can't be, oh, the previous contingent thing. that form of explanation doesn't work for that question, because you can just raise that same question about the previous contingent thing. So there has to be a necessary being, a being that could not have not existed, and a being that does not depend on anything else for its existence. That has to be the basis of this physical reality of contingent things in which we find ourselves. So in this version of the cosmological argument, here again, God is conceived as the necessary being. I mentioned one long-standing criticism of this argument. One old criticism of this argument focuses in on that third premise. We'll see a little bit later in this unit of the course that the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume challenged the truth of that premise. Aquinas stipulates that if everything is contingent, at some point nothing existed. Well, Hume and others have argued there's nothing incoherent in positing a succession of contingent things that has simply always existed. Every particular member of the chain has been contingent, but for whatever reason, the chain of contingent things has always been going on. So some philosophers, some readers just in general, have denied the truth of that premise, have argued there's nothing incoherent in positing a succession that has always been going on. So that's one thing to think about in critically assessing this argument. Is that plausible? Is Aquinas assuming that there's something implausible here that really isn't so? That is really a perfectly coherent state of affairs that you can conceive of. That's one thing to think about. Another old criticism of this argument, and we'll find this criticism in Hume as well, is that there's a kind of fallacy involved from saying that just because every particular part of the universe is contingent, therefore the whole thing must be contingent, and therefore there must be a necessary being to explain why there is the whole succession of contingent things. Sometimes it is what is called in logic a composition fallacy, to say that because all the parts of something have a certain property, therefore the whole thing must have that property. You know, sometimes that's a good inference, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's a fallacy involved. And so one criticism of the argument from contingency would be that it involves a kind of composition fallacy. A composition inference is just any inference from the parts to the whole. And sometimes an inference from the parts to the whole, that is to say, an argument of this form. The parts all have some property, therefore the whole thing must have that property. You know, sometimes that's a good inference. Take this example. Every brick in the wall is red, therefore the wall is red. Or therefore, maybe every brick that I'm going to use to build the wall is red, therefore the wall is going to be red. That seems like a perfectly good inference, doesn't it? It seems like in that case the property that the parts have really does transfer to the whole thing. But a composition inference can be fallacious as well. Sometimes it's in the nature of the relation between the parts and the whole. Sometimes it's in the nature of the property under discussion. The property doesn't transfer from the parts to the whole. So take this inference, for example. Every brick in the wall weighs 1 pound, or maybe every brick that I'm going to use to build the wall weighs 1 pound. Therefore, the wall is going to weigh 1 pound. Clearly, that would not be a good inference. And yet, that argument is of exactly the same logical form as the previous argument. The logical form of the two arguments is identical, isn't it? And yet, the first argument's a good one. The first inference is a good one. The second argument is not a good. Second inference is not a good one. What accounts for the difference? Well, there's no simple answer to that question. You know, sometimes the property transfers from the parts to the whole, sometimes it does not. So it's an old criticism of the argument from contingency that just because every particular thing in the universe is contingent, it doesn't necessarily follow that the universe as a whole is contingent. So that's a question to think about in assessing this argument. If every part of the world is contingent, does it follow that the world is therefore contingent? Aquinas is assuming that that is true in presenting this argument, because he's saying that those premises lead up to a kind of logical necessity for us to posit, to put forward a necessary being, to serve as the ground, to serve as the basis for why there is this succession of contingent beings at all. But the argument only goes through if the fact that, or at least this might be the criticism, look, that argument only goes through if the fact that everything in the world is contingent has the consequence that the world is contingent. But here again, we've seen that many readers, many philosophers would deny that there's any incoherence in positing a succession of contingent things that has just always been going on. So that's one consideration. And here again, a slightly different thought would be, even if everything in the world is contingent, it wouldn't necessarily follow that the universe as a whole is contingent. Maybe for whatever reason, the universe is eternal, and so could not have not existed. Maybe the universe itself was necessary for reasons that we don't understand, reasons that have to do not with a necessary being that is somehow distinct from the universe itself, but for whatever reason that we don't understand, the universe itself is a necessary being. Okay, well, think what you will of that. That historically has been one criticism of the argument. David Hume would argue that there isn't anything more perplexing about saying that than there is about saying there has to be a, well, let me put it this way. There isn't anything more perplexing about positing an always existing and eternal, and hence necessary, universe. There isn't anything more perplexing about positing that than is involved in positing a distinct necessary being that is eternal and brought into being the contingent universe. Hume would argue there's no more difficulty in conceiving the one state of affairs than the other. So that's something that you'll have to think about in assessing the argument for yourself.